up in and out of homeless shelters, it made it very difficult for me to fit in back when I was in school. I was constantly teased for the clothes that I would wear and the shoes that I had, so much that eventually it took toll on my personality, and I became an introvert. I wouldn't really interact or engage much with other students at the school that I was going to. And by the time I got to the 11th grade, I was blessed to have been walking past a track coach one day as he looks at me and said, "Hey, how come every time I walk past you, you're looking down and looking at the ground?" And I said, "Well, every time I look up, there's always something mean that someone says something mean about the gear and things that I'm wearing." So he said, "Well, why don't you get around some positive and encouraging people? You should come out and join our track team and give it a shot." I said, "All right, cool." So I started training that winter break with the track team at my high school. And one of the things that he shared with me right before my first race, he told me, "You can run away from homelessness, and you can run away from some of the things that you're dealing with at home and really enhance your life." So I took that very serious, and the first time that I ever stepped foot on the track, I ended up running a mile in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. And at that time, I went overnight from becoming this kid at the high school who I felt like no one even really paid attention to, or whenever they did pay attention to me, there were usually mean comments that they would say. Now, all of a sudden, I was a track star on campus, and everyone wanted to become my friend, so much that I would show up at track meets and pretty much went undefeated most of my season while I was there at the high school. And eventually, I ended up getting a scholarship to college where I ran track, and then I ran for 2 years with the Nike Farm team, which was an Olympic development program while I was in school. And just that experience, it really took me away from being this homeless kid and feeling helpless to realizing that I'm capable of doing so much more. So I took a job eventually as a peer mentor for challenged youth, and I went and started spending time inside these homeless shelters to talk to kids and really try to get them to change their situation around. And for many of them, it was hard for them to dream big or visualize themselves outside of the situation that they were in. So I figured I could make it easier by showing them. So I decided to set out to create this event called the Hollywood Half Marathon, where I wanted thousands of people to run along Hollywood Boulevard, where I would raise funds and awareness for homeless teens in the Los Angeles area. And it was a phenomenal experience for a lot of the homeless kids that were in the shelters there in LA to see that, wow, this guy who came right from the same places that we used to live in has accomplished such a major feat. And in producing this event for years, roughly about 3 years ago, things took a very interesting turn as we were packing up and we left the Hollywood Half Marathon. And the following day, the Boston Marathon was scheduled. And that Monday, I remember my crew and I and our staff were back home and we're watching the Boston Marathon, and we hear about the bombs that went off. And we have friends that were participating in the event, and even the organizer of the event, who was a friend of mine at the time. You know, we're calling in and we're trying to reach people to find out, is this real and what's happening out there? And during that time, I felt, maybe I can go out there and do something about it. So I spent the whole year trying to train and qualify to run the Boston Marathon, just to kind of show my support, not only as a runner, but also as a race organizer and someone who feels that whenever a negative situation happens, that maybe I can turn it around into a positive. So in training for the Boston Marathon, I committed a full year to trying to qualify. And my qualifying time that I needed to run was 3 hours and 5 minutes to be able to participate in the Boston Marathon. And after running for roughly 12 months straight trying to prepare for this race, the race that I qualified or tried to qualify to run the Boston Marathon, I ended up running 3 hours, 5 minutes, and 23 seconds. So that 23 seconds caused me to not be able to participate in the Boston Marathon. And it was very disheartening, so I had figured, maybe I've got to figure out a better way to show my support rather than just running in the race. So I told some friends of mine, hey, maybe I'll go out to the Boston Marathon and just print free hugs on a T-shirt and try to give people hugs as they're running by. And of course, my friends right away said, that's just about the stupidest idea. No one's going to hug some random guy just standing on the race course. But I did, and in going out there and doing it, the thing went viral. And it ended up on news sites all over the country, and everyone was talking about this video that I created where I'm giving hugs to strangers. And it seemed like the country, and maybe even various parts of the world, were really moved by this outpouring of love. And the comments that I started to receive from people was that, it was really uplifting and encouraging for them to see that. So I realized maybe I can go into other really difficult situations and try to turn things around. And so I started showing up at riots and protests that were taking place around the country, not just to engage in interactions and dialogue with people, but also just to be a reminder of love, even in such volatile situations where there was a lot of chaos in those places. And, going from trying to change situations around with feel-good videos to where now all of a sudden I'm on the front lines of these really difficult situations, you can imagine for my friends and family, it's really difficult for them to watch this. Even as I'm on the front lines of one of those riots there, I remember getting a call from my mom while I'm there, and she's watching it on the news back at home, and I answer the call like, Mom, I'm busy right now, and she obviously sees what I'm doing, and she's like, you need to get out of there. You're not safe. And I said, well, no one's safe, and so I'm really trying to turn this into a more positive experience and try to de-escalate some of the violence that's there. And fortunately, I've been really effective in doing that, in showing up at these riots and protests and trying to get people to kind of protect the area that they're in. I grew up when I was in South Central Los Angeles in the 90s during the Rodney King riots that took place there. I remember even being poor and living in a shelter, my mom made sure that none of us left the house to go out and loot or participate in the things that were going on there. And so now when I show up at these things, I'm really trying to remind people to protect their city. Why would they destroy their own city? It's never made sense to me. And so sometimes that dialogue and the interactions that I have with people, it's not always very well received. I've gotten into physical altercations with people out there, but many times I've been able to get through to protesters who share with me that, just by my being there, that it's been really encouraging for them to know that there is a better way rather than this us versus them mentality that we have. And so I continue producing these videos, and I have people travel out with me when I'm on the front lines of these riots and protests to really try to de-escalate the violence that's taking place there, and to show people who are watching at home that, there is a better way, that we can turn these really negative situations into positives. And so in doing so, sometimes when I'm out at these protests, it can be very tough when you're in situations like that where people have their guns out and rocks and bottles and things are being thrown at police officers. But one of the ways I've really been able to turn things around is while I'm there, the interactions and the dialogue that I have with people, especially law enforcement and protesters, I always invite them to come out and let's figure out ways to uplift and kind of be more positive in the communities that these incidents are happening in. And so this example here with the large riot police officer who I had given a hug there on the front lines, months later, just through us remaining in contact afterwards, now I travel around with a group of police officers, and sometimes we go into really difficult cities, and some of these officers are people that I've met on the front lines of protests, or some of them that have reached out online to share with me how moving and uplifting that experience has been in seeing just a civilian that's out there really trying to bring peace to a situation. So I invite them to come along with me as we travel around with this organization called Humanizing the Badge, and we go in and serve in homeless shelters, some of the same places that I grew up in, now being able to really turn that situation around and have police officers kind of see the other side and sit down with some of the people that are living in these shelters and the drug rehabilitation centers and just be able to really listen to their stories, and vice versa for the people who are in those places who have issues with law enforcement and don't really see them as members of the community, for them to all really sit down and engage in discussions that can kind of change their hearts and minds around of how they perceive each other. So, I'd just like to always try to remind people that anytime you're facing a difficult situation, don't just look at the bright side of it, but try to figure out ways that you can turn it into an amazing experience. Thank you.